Hi, I'm Matthew Holt. It is the THCB Gang. It is the April Fool's Day edition, so I have a bunch of potentially foolish April Fools on with me. I don't know. I don't know anyone saw a good April Fool's gag or did an April Fool's gag this morning, other than the state of the world that we're living in as a whole. All right, THCB Gang from April the 1st, episode 49. I have a great lineup today. Small but mighty. THCB Gang. It is the April Fool's Day. And I have forgotten to turn off the recording part of it. April Fool's on with me. So hopefully that'll work better. Thank you. that'll get cut out of the the podcast version. I apologize for those people watching. All right, who's on with me today? Jeff Goldsmith, veteran health futurist from Virginia. Rosemarie Day, policy consultant, author from Boston. Michael Millenson, a healthcare quality and safety expert from Chicago. And Vince Kuraitis, consultant, techie, policy analyst, all the way from Idaho. All right, guys. Hopefully I won't screw this up as much. Vince is always saying to me I should get Zoya back, but we can't afford it now. She's a rich venture capitalist. So there we go. So I hope everyone's had a good week, good couple of weeks since I've seen some of you. Stuff is happening, right? On the policy front, on the vaccine front, and unfortunately on the surge of the COVID front, as well as international stuff and big picture stuff is happening. Kind of as we're having problems with China. So let's go around and see what everyone's been looking at. I will start with you, Vince.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Matthew, and hi all. I would like to start with two calls for accountability. Excuse me, while I'm using this world stage to ask some folks to explain some things that are going on. First is an article in today's Washington Post. I'll read you the headline. The headline is, "Some of America's wealthiest hospital systems ended up even richer thanks to federal bailouts." And I think it's particularly timely that longtime hospital experts Jeff and Michael are going to be part of this discussion. The gist of the article is that we are seeing a K-shaped recovery, with the rich becoming richer and the rural and smaller hospitals really struggling over the last year. And as much as $1 billion going to some of these hospital systems. There is some good news in here in the sense that a few of these actually returned the federal funds, one of which was Mayo. And surprisingly, Hospital Corporation of America returned the funds, but most hospitals are just hanging on. And actually, despite the headlines we've been seeing of hospitals struggling under COVID, a lot of them are doing better than they've ever done. The second area of discussion that I'd like to frame is about accountability. And yeah, it's April Fool's Day, but it's also the opening day for Major League Baseball. And in particular, I want to call out MLB, Major League Baseball, and in particular, the Los Angeles Dodgers. And those of you who have followed the THCB Gang might remember that I am a lifelong Dodgers fan. The scenario of as a kid, as I'm 12 years old, listening to Dodger announcer Vin Scully with the transistor radio underneath my pillow, mom thinking I'm asleep. And we hadn't won a World Series for so long. And then last year we did it. And the call for accountability really is around MLB and COVID again. You might remember, I'll refresh your memory, of Justin Turner, that bozo, who after the Dodgers won and after he had been diagnosed positively with COVID in that last game, rushed out onto the field, joined the dog pile, kissed his wife, and generally pretty much ignored all of the things that one should do when one has COVID. I did read one article that 5 people in the Dodgers organization, wasn't traced specifically back to Justin, but that's the call for accountability. And I will end with a note of how differently, I mean, this is like the federal government in the states, how differently the different leagues, the different teams are being allowed to treat COVID. I heard on an NPR story this morning of how many people are going to be allowed into the first game. In Boston, the answer to that, it's a small park. Okay, 4,000 people. Chicago, they're letting in 8,000 people. In Colorado's opener with the Dodgers, there are going to be up to 20,000 people there. And then I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by this. For the Texas Rangers opener this Sunday, they're opening up everything. 40,000 people. All right, thank you. That's my outrage, and thanks for letting me vet.
I like the vending, Vince, because we've got two big things there, right? The state of hospital, state of the healthcare system, and the resurge, or the surge, or the fourth surge, or the fourth wave. And if you look out to other countries, the Germans are closing down completely. The French are just shutting their school system. There's going on. Of course, they are not where we are in vaccines. Rosemarie, what have you been up to this week? What have you been looking at?
Well, on a personal note, speaking of vaccines, I think we've shared when we've gotten ours, and I actually got mine on Monday, my first shot. So I was so happy. It was like tears of joy kind of thing when I was on a standby line and they called my name, and it was like winning the lottery is how it felt. So really excited, and more people, it's happening. So it's just keeping the faith, and then trying to make sure that the uptake of vaccines can exceed this race against the new variants and what have you, which has all the leaders in my healthcare system market extremely worried about whatever. Did you say fourth surge? Yeah, I guess or third surge. So that's what we're tracking. But I would also just say the good news of the stimulus checks coming out, and the subsidies that are hitting the Obamacare marketplaces and making healthcare much more affordable, and building on the structure we've got, is incredibly good news from my point of view. And seeing, just the stories of people who are now going to be able to, come off of COBRA, which they can't afford, and find their way through to the marketplace. This is going to benefit the middle class in a way that we just haven't before. And that, to me, takes us closer to universal health care. I'll leave it there.
Michael.
Well, speaking of universal health care, I was surprised this week to see Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz introduce a bill for universal health care that would be co-sponsored in the House by AOC. Right. However, this being April Fool's Day, I realized that
they're not getting us. Come on.
had not happened. And Vince, somebody from LA saying to someone in Chicago that it was, quote, a long time since your team won the World Series.
No comment.
Well, last year it was a longer time for LA than it was since the last time the Cubs won.
I think it was 89 for the Dodgers.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
So when's the last time Chicago won one?
Well, the Cubs were in 2016 after 101 years. Yeah. The White Sox a few years before that, after about 90 years. So and I grew up in DC, so it was a long wait between the Washington Senators and the Washington Nationals also. But the Dodgers, I believe, had it a couple of times in between those decades. I think, to me, what's interesting is the way, of course, everything's all COVID all the time, but in different ways, right? So yes, we have the fourth wave worries, and we have a lot of other kinds of things happening directly related to vaccination and to testing and all the rest of that. But the shock of COVID has enabled the administration to open up healthcare we saw the expansion of Medicaid incentives in the previous American Rescue Act. And now Biden is talking about $400 billion to encourage Medicaid, to allow care at home, right? Follow the person, the money follows the person. And really, even though it's Medicaid and they're talking about lowering the Medicare eligibility age, which I'm not so necessarily sure it's a great idea, but also drug prices, right? Everything is the focus of the shock of COVID is allowing some ideas that have been floating around a long time to kind of be perceived as urgent, as something that's really important to at least get out. And so, just as kind of World War I caused the monarchies of Europe to disintegrate, the COVID epidemic is causing some of the established monarchies and rulers of the healthcare system to quake in their boots. Now, not entirely, right? The rich hospitals can still do quite well, thank you. But there's a lot of change going on that COVID has opened up, and I think the kinds of things that the Biden administration is proposing are indicators of that.
Jeff, you have a chance to disagree with Michael.
No, I mean, he's right. I mean, he didn't even mention the infrastructure bill that was, or infrastructure program that was released yesterday. $2 trillion of additional spending, not directed at stimulus, but directed over really filling gaps over the next 10 years. Infrastructure is defined in a way that sprawls. Roads and bridges are only 5% of the $2 trillion. You've got rural broadband, which, as somebody who's on 2005 bandwidth DSL, I can hardly wait for my farm to get like into the second decade of the century in terms of bandwidth. Maybe I can start watching movies now, streaming. That would be awesome. But $400 billion with a B for essentially paying family caregivers to take care of their family members. I think there is going to be this is going to be a very heavy lift. They're not going to put it all on the tab and charge our grandchildren for it. They're going to try and take back a big chunk of Donald Trump's tax concessions to corporations to pay for it. Lots of luck with that. I am really, I'm kind of in awe of these guys. I mean, I think the people that watched Obama go small, play small ball on economic recovery, and then spend 15 months getting this arcane and complicated healthcare bill through Congress. These guys have learned their lessons. They're not going to wait around and hope that their majority increases. They're hanging on by their fingernails in the House. They can only lose 5 votes, and they don't get anything. So I think there's what is that phrase? The fierce urgency of now has really seized this administration, and this senior citizen president of ours is behaving in a very sprightly fashion.
That's it. Well, 78 is the new 25.
I want to add something quickly on infrastructure, which I think is important. We in healthcare tend to focus only on how the things we want to happen take a long time. People drive on roads and over bridges every single day of the year. That bridge that collapsed in Minnesota was pretty dramatic, right? And yet we still haven't gotten anything through, right? And so it gets a D, and people use it as an obvious problem. It's not like health insurance, which most people don't want to think about, or a lot of the other things in healthcare, which are really invisible. This is an incredibly visible problem, and yet we have ignored it. So it's not just us. And then the second thing is that I find distressing, but perhaps also analogous to healthcare. Here where our infrastructure is collapsing, it's a huge need, absolutely a huge need. We spend billions of dollars on self-driving cars. And you got to ask yourself, if you ask the average person, would you rather your road has fewer potholes or someone brings you a self-driving car? It's pretty clear what the answer would be. But of course, the economic incentives are for self-driving cars, as opposed to the unglamorous private market incentives of repairing roads. You need Congress and people to do it. So it's not just us that we have fancy, new diagnostic equipment and we ignore people in nursing homes. And for the price of one ophthalmologist, we could hire, private duty nurses for everyone in the county, right? It's all over the country. And the infrastructure bill is a great illustration of the proclivity to put off what's needed.
Yeah, Michael,
but-
so a question for you. Would you not agree, though, that the roads and bridges part of it is probably the part that is going to be the most bipartisan, and no one's really going to disagree on that?
Absolutely. Everybody's in favor of spending money locally on their and having the federal government pick up the tab. But the point is that things that have the roads and the bridges and the piping and the things that were living off that legacy have long been in dire need of repair. And the Republicans could have, Trump said he's going to have infrastructure, and it just never happened. It's not glamorous.
But it's important to add that our roads and bridges are not the only part of our societal superstructure that is obsolete. Our social safety net, we haven't done anything meaningful to improve that social safety net since 1972, except for the Affordable Care Act. Right. And that's it. And the Affordable Care Act only brought 25 million people or so to coverage. It has been, demonstrated repeatedly. We grossly underinvest in the social and human services that could keep people out of hospitals, keep people out of the criminal justice system. There's been no advocacy for it at all. And in an interest group democracy, the squeaky wheel doesn't get, the wheel that doesn't get greased. So,
right, because what we like to invest in, and this is the other side of what Matthew does, is the shiny new objects. Right. That's like the hallmark of America.
Artificial intelligence.
We're excited about those things, and we get bored to tears with anything that is actually about like the day-to-day governing and doing things like procuring roads and bridges.
And I used to write about
$400 billion
right
for caregiving is an astonishing good idea. I mean, it is. Women are being driven out of the labor market because they can't manage, their kids at home, their older people at home. It's had a disproportionate influence in damaging the lives of tens of millions of American women. And, we've just been paralyzed. We haven't been able to do anything.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm going to just interrupt for a second. I have just come off of 6 weeks of caregiving for my elderly mother in California. Mm-hmm. And the only way I could do that without taking a leave of absence or quitting my job is the fact that I actually run my own company and I can decide when and where I work. So basically I just work all the time, but I can do it like at odd hours. And that's how I do it. But so many women do not have that option.
Right.
So let me try and square the circle here a bit. I have a nice nugget which I'm going to try to get in later, but which I found a great study about the VA in Michigan, which I'll get in later. But on this topic, I think there's something going on. So the first thing is that yes, we can go off at Silicon Valley and Elon Musk's tweeting away about GameStop and all the other silly stuff. But there is now it's from all the billionaires, so take that as you will. There is now some interest in what I would call infrastructure type stuff. Maybe not in caregiving, although I think there is a role for technology to advance in caregiving. There's a lot of money gone into that in terms of home care and home monitoring and that kind of stuff. But I know it needs human beings as well. Eventually it'll need robotics. But there's also a lot of infrastructure type stuff in terms of upgrading the electric grid, moving up electric vehicles, the rest of it. And I'll argue with Michael about the self-driving car thing. It may not be here next year, it may not be here in 5 years, but when it shows up, if we get electric vehicles that are self-driving, it'll collapse the price of transportation because you'll have these big fleets of vehicles that don't require drivers. It'll be cheaper for somebody to have a membership of a transportation as a service system rather than to have to own their own car, pay their own insurance, pay their own gas, and spend their own time driving themselves around rather than doing all the stuff in the car. And that I think I'm a big proponent of a friend of mine called Tony Sieber, who's been writing about this for years. I think that will change and improve lives of people all over America greatly. I would, but just let you finish, Vince. Jeff, Jeff and Vince, you guys you probably were old enough to remember as a contemporary, not quite. There was a guy called J.K. Galbraith, who was an economist back in the 60s, and he wrote about private opulence and public squalor. And that's kind of the problem we've got that we need to fix, right? Because we have spent too much money on private opulence. And unfortunately, it's mostly been on tax cuts for the rich and new handbags for Khloe Kardashian and not enough roads, bridges, and other stuff. But I agree, we are moving there. Having said all that, let me, and maybe Vince come in on this, but maybe somebody else. We have some political obstacles to go before that 400 billion or any of the rest of the $2 trillion gets through, namely this thing called the filibuster and this guy called Joe Manchin in Virginia and elsewhere, so West Virginia and elsewhere. So where do you think we are? It's a nice proposal. What actually is going to happen?
Well, I mean, that's going to come down a lot to the marketing of these proposals. Buried in that infrastructure package is 5 to 7 million more union jobs. And that hasn't been talked about very much at all. But, the whole point of that caregiver initiative, a big piece of it was to try and unionize the caregivers that aren't family members that are out there. That huge bolus of spending on whatever, the electric grid, the roads and bridges, whatever, will go to union contractors. So there is a huge political payoff buried in that $2 trillion, the goal of which is to reverse the decline in the percentage of Americans that are members of labor unions, which right now is less than 10%. So I think that's a big piece of it. But, the idea that you can communicate with women that, guess what? We really want to help you have a life. And if you actually want to work, we'll help you do that by creating an infrastructure that enables you to have someone else take care of the older people in your family or your kids or whatever it is. If you want to continue working, that is, I think, politically a game changer. And it really does address a group of people that are in play politically. That is working class women, lower middle class or middle class women that really don't have a choice and that can't spend 20 or 25 grand a year on childcare. I mean, the idea that you're going to do something massively helpful to them is a huge political plus. And I think this, the marketing of this politically, the idea that, Congressman X, even a Republican congressman, is going to have to explain to crowds of angry women in his or her district why they voted against this. I mean, I think it's going to be I think there are a lot of opportunities to do a better job than Obama did in selling some of this stuff to the public.
Philip, let me ask the direct question. Right? So actually, and Janet Yellen put out a tweet stream, which may be the first Treasury Secretary, about labor force participation going back to 1970 for women and how it changed and how little it's changed since then, right? But what a bigger change it was in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and then how we've had little change. In fact, it's progressed under the COVID recession. But let's ask the real question. Are we, even if something close, that's jockeying around, are we going to be able to dislodge 10 Republicans in the Senate to vote in favor of this thing? Is that possible?
I don't think you need to do that. If you push it through under reconciliation, you don't need the 10 votes. There's no way on earth. They're not going to get 2 Republican votes. Yeah. They're not going to get them. And they're not going to break the filibuster to do it because it's too dangerous.
So it's back to the
they might go the talking filibuster, right? Because that's, at least that, but nonetheless, I agree with Jeff. And the problem is that because of the gerrymandering, there's no accountability in the House. And in the Senate, it's turning into a parliamentary system. And frankly, given the chances of the Republicans taking back the Senate in 2 years, what most of the Republican senators are more scared of is what Mitch McConnell will do to them than what might happen to them in their vote, right? Because beneath the surface, you could end up on the Senate Committee on Plumbing with an office about a mile and a half away from the Capitol in the basement. So they know what can happen, and that's what's kept them together.
But so how much? I know we don't look at this that carefully, but how much of this can get passed in reconciliation without changing stuff? I'm always baffled by the fact that it's okay to appoint a Supreme Court justice for life with only 50 votes or 51 votes, but it's not okay to pass as random legislation. But do we have to break this up? Do you think? How do you think it'll turn out? What do you think will be the impact on caregiving and the rest of the infrastructure stuff?
Well, it's a massive impact. And you're talking about a sector that's gotten just starved to death. And huge inequity based on family income. So, there's a compelling public policy upside to all of this. And back on the filibuster thing for a minute, Ruth Marcus, who's not a moderate Democrat, is a columnist at the Washington Post, had a really interesting piece in the Post about 5 days ago on what the next Republican-controlled government would do to social policy with no filibuster.
Absolutely.
And it was absolutely terrifying.
Right.
And this is not an apologist for Republicans. This is a hardcore liberal Democrat, basically arguing we're going to hate ourselves in the morning for doing this. And if you look at the Supreme Court, I mean, the Democrats basically broke the filibuster to get judicial nominees, not Supreme Court nominees, appointed during Obama. And they paved the way for 3 Republican Supreme Court justices to be shoved up their keisters by Donald Trump. So didn't they learn anything from that exchange? The Dems lost that first round on the filibuster. They lost it. So I think, all this talk about, what they need to do is they need to build their majorities. And the only way they're going to do that is by improving people's lives. That's the only way they're going to do it. Because, the deck is stacked against them.
And by communicating. And by communicating, I mean, I remember both the Clinton and the Obama healthcare plans. In the case of the Clinton plan, it was so complicated that Rostenkowski got it wrong at a speech. I remember when I was a reporter for the Tribune, he gave a talk about it, and he mixed up all the elements. And when I went to ask his people, did he mean that? No, he got it mixed up. Then I went to turn in a story, and they said, well, that's not what our reporters have been writing. They've been writing what Rostenkowski said. I said, well, they're mixed up too, right? And so they didn't explain it. And then when you got to Obama, again, this kind of non-explaining. So can they get past? If you look at what Fox is saying, you look at what the Wall Street Journal is saying and everything else like this, it is a subtle to blatant kind of, this is not really helping your life, and this is really not whatever. And can they get past that? And I think that they really need to do they have a lot of explaining to do. And I would agree completely with Jeff that if they break the filibuster, they will regret it deeply. And given what's likely to happen in the midterms, so they need to learn how to get out of their own echo chamber and out of the right-wing echo chamber and learn to communicate effectively.
Well, we'll see if they can pass that with or without this. So let's move on. The point.
Well, just a word on the communicating, right? So Kamala Harris is going to be heading the vaccine outreach initiative, and they've got all kinds of, I think, great coalition building going on here to do this major blitz. So I think that's a huge step in the right direction, just to throw that in.
All right. So I want to go back to what Vince raised, which is about the hospital systems and the hospital systems that are making hay, out of the Sunshine or out of the CARES Act and all the rest of it. So the thing I was going to start at the front of the podcast with my little bit from last week is there was an interesting little survey, paper actually, in the Journal of, it was a regular medical journal, Journal of Internal Medicine, General Internal Medicine, in which 23 people who were in Michigan hospitals with COVID were transferred because of lack of beds in those general hospitals to the VA. And of the 23, 20 of the 20, so they liked the VA experience. 11 said that they received better care at the VA than compared to where they come from. And the other 10 said it was about the same. And most of them said the doctors were either the better or the same than the other hospital they come from. So
the point is what?
The point, I'm not saying that we're going to change the healthcare system completely and go from everyone joining the VA expanding to all hospital care. But I am saying that when you have a situation where a little anecdote like that, the VA, dreaded socialized government medicine, is doing okay. And as Vince points out, a lot of hospitals who are getting, who are doing fine on the stock market and doing fine and have been doing fine, in their overall revenue, including with the CARES Act. Is there going to be some changes coming about because of that? Plus, because of that shiny new technology that's getting all the money in the other world I live in from Silicon Valley. That's obviously going to start. That is looking at people who are going to start trying to think about if they can go around hospitals with virtual primary care with folks like Optum and others buying medical groups and getting into that. So Vince, I want to come back to you about push a bit more about what you were talking about.
Yeah. So let me bring Jeff's article recently into this. Jeff, you and Ian Morrison recently wrote an article in Health Affairs, and I'll paraphrase it. You can push back if you want, but my paraphrasing was you were arguing hospitals have been the good guys during COVID. Mm-hmm. And the distinction I would make, though, is, yeah, hospital frontline workers have really taken it on the chin and have been heroic. But we got to make a distinction here. Hospital administration, hospital executives have not been acting very well. The Prophet article today in Washington Post, the recent headlines about so few hospitals complying with price transparency regulations. I have a hard time casting the hospital executive world in any kind of a favorable light.
Well, I've hardly been an apologist for the industry. I've been one of one of its most strident critics over the last 20 years.
You have been, and I can tell you that, and that's why I scratched my head over your article.
If it wasn't for systems like Northwell and Columbia Presbyterian, we would have lost tens of thousands more people in the first wave of this epidemic than we did. And the ability to mobilize at scale across a community or region simply wouldn't have been there if these systems hadn't been created and brought into being, because they were the only entities that were really capable of managing the assembly and disbursement of services. Our public health system certainly couldn't do it, and is still.
I can agree with you, and I would rephrase that as, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Well, but they did a whole bunch of other things too. I mean, if you knew what was going on in Florida or California for that matter, the governors were on the phone to these CEOs, and the CEOs who were, competitors up until COVID were working together.
They're doing that here in Boston too.
I'll give you that. Yeah, I think there has been some really good collaboration among hospitals.
Try and get a testing system stood up to try and get their people vaccinated, and then to push vaccines out beyond their own people. They did a heroic job. And that right. was the management of these institutions that was doing that.
And I would add that some of the safety net hospitals teaming up with the community health centers, and in big time, like that is into this, hopefully the good kind of surge of getting people vaccinated, is incredible kind of partnerships as well. I wonder if there's a distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals.
Remember that, the for-profit industry is a lot more complicated than most people think. The Detroit Medical Center is a for-profit entity, okay? So is the Baptist Health System, a large inner-city hospital system in San Antonio. So it's not just that vision of, the gilded community hospitals sitting in the fancy part of town. These guys are all over the place. They're 20% of the hospitals in the country.
And on the other side, our friends in the nonprofit world say, I like to say UPMC puts the profit into not-for-profit, right? So they're, with the private plane and the suite of the entire floor of the office building. But I think, Vince, what you're bringing up, as what Jeff is saying, is really an important call for people like us who are a little more sophisticated to avoid the good guy, bad guy, right? So,
I totally agree.
So
we need to parse this.
Was Northwell's management responsible for an incredible response that saved lives along with its front workers? Absolutely. Did Northwell then take advantage in another part of its system, again, I'm sure approved by the same CEO, to charge people, $3,000 for a COVID test? This was in the New York Times, and telling them it's an emergency room visit? Absolutely. And so what you have is a combination of, under emergency circumstances, acting with an incredible dedication to mission, and under non-emergency circumstances, often acting with incredible dedication to profit maximization. And it's a mix. And so it'd be nice to see a simple for-profit, not-for-profit, or good guys, bad guys, good managers, bad managers. And unfortunately, it's not that. And, personally, as I've been, for me, as someone who spent really a career writing about quality of care and patient safety, the thing that's been most difficult is that bad things often are done by good people, right, with good motives. And so, it's difficult in healthcare to differentiate good guys, bad guys. You can really only talk about good actions, bad actions. And that is sort of less satisfying, but it's kind of the way it is.
And that's
So,
the
well,
point.
let me make a
rephrase.
question about where this is heading in some of the stuff that's going on. So if you look at where people are where Medicare and CMS is heading, they're continuing to push Medicare Advantage. I just saw there's a lobby group in DC which is called it's the Pro Medicare Advantage lobby group run by all the Medicare plans. Just put a report saying how great Medicare Advantage was, how fantastically advantageous people in Medicare Advantage was, because they got all these great new, how much cheaper it was for them for their out-of-pocket spending, all that kind of good stuff. Didn't obviously note the fact that Medicare Advantage is costing the taxpayer a lot more per enrollee than the rest, and there's considerable upcoding in the risk adjustment factor by all the plans and
a 5% margin
well, right.
earned by the carrier.
And gaming the system on the STARS rating too. So really it's a holistic effort.
But we're getting more of that. Now we're getting direct medical contracting, which I don't really understand. It's an attempt to put the same kind of at-risk program there so that medical groups and others can do that. We've had 2 IPOs, I think, in recent weeks, Alignment and I'm blanking on another one that's coming up that isn't IPO'd yet, which are kind of management services organizations going to be surrounding direct medical contracting. We know historically from way back when, from work done in the 90s, that if you get enough medical groups and give them enough risk, they stop admitting to hospitals as much, and it puts those hospitals in those areas under pressure. Is there any sense that we're going to be moving to a place where, yes, it's all great to be Northwell and then New York Presbyterian and Houston Methodist do great work while the pandemic was raging, but is there a sense that the change is going to be enough to put those big hospital systems doing fee for service under pressure? I see Jeff shaking his head.
Look, I mean, it's just people have this idea that if you change the payment system, everything else follows. And, you've basically got to go back to DRGs 36 years ago to find the last time a significant change in incentives really changed anything in the care system. 36 years. So, I mean, all of this stuff about risk and, and we got to get
Jeff, how does that
the primary care groups and they'll keep people out of hospitals. I mean, for crying out loud, don't we learn?
Well, so is it that incentives don't work, or we just didn't change incentives? This may not be a big enough change in incentives.
There's a huge amount of illness out there, guys. And, we want to make it cheaper to take care of all that illness. Who are we going to delegate to make people less ill, right? I mean, we haven't done a very good job of that. And look at COVID. People have lost 600,000 people.
Jeff, it's not just
avoidable.
It's not just
societal crisis. Because we couldn't get our shit together as a society. And we're talking about, we're going to take our 5th run at changing the incentives to doctors and hospitals, and everything will be fine.
No, Jeff, it's not just burden of illness. The reason DRGs work is semi-worked, right? And then they found ways around it. And by the way, I'm disappointed that Matthew didn't ask you simply, can hospitals survive? I was waiting for the answer to that.
No problem.
But the thing is that if you dabble with incentives so that nobody loses, right? I mean, the fact is that every congressman believes that the hospital in its district is above average, right? And you saw during even the Clinton administration, when the report cards came out and showed that the hospitals in Puerto Rico and New York that serve the poor sucked, they stopped doing quality data, right? Cook County Hospital, which is hardly in Palm Springs, was doing fine. But, when political interests show that your people are the losers, we don't want to have losers. And we all know there's plenty of waste in the system. But who are you going to do? You're going to squeeze your local doctor who believes that, what he's doing is correct. And that goes to the good guys, bad guys thing again, right? And nobody wants to squeeze their hospital or their local specialists. And it's a problem. And so we do these half-assed little sort of nobody wants to bell the cat kind of things. And I agree the illness burden is up. But if you look at inappropriate care, ineffective care, all the rest, there is plenty of waste in the system.
I've got a comment on the rise of virtual care and telehealth in the last year, which if I were in a hospital's shoes, I would be certainly not seeing in my financial interests. I'm
not sure I understand the question. What's the question?
Was that the comment? Or it's just not?
The hospitals will, label me as one of those guys who thinks get the incentives right and the world will change, Jeff. What you're saying is, what I interpret you're saying is we tried to tweak it 5 times, it hasn't worked, but I'm not hearing it. I'm not hearing your proposal. I mean, what I'm inferring is let's stop.
We have grossly underinvested in the social and human services that support people in our communities. Right. And if you look, this is Rosemarie, was it Rosemarie Shape? What was the name of the woman that amazing book a couple of years ago? That if you add up medical spending and social and human services spending, we're about in the middle of the OECD.
That was the healthcare.
We grossly underinvest in the social and human services that could keep people out of hospitals, keep people out of prison, whatever it is. And we, I think it is safe to say, overinvest in intensive medical care services.
Well,
so
I think we're on the
my argument is there's a sectoral imbalance in investment in our society, and that we really need to be focusing our attention on that. That was what the social HMO was supposed to be about. That was what broadening the benefits package for Medicaid was supposed to be about. But the problem is we haven't been able to manage that transition from medicalizing problems to trying to deal with them at their roots in a sensible and thoughtful way. So I just think this idea that if we just get the right operant conditioning schedule for doctors and hospitals, health costs will come under control and everything will be fine. I think we're done with it. We've been at that for 50 years and failed.
Okay,
and for the interested listener, it was the American healthcare paradox. Why spending more is getting us less. Yep. Elizabeth Bradley and Lauren Taylor, seminal work.
Wonderful.
It's a wonderful.
We're dead on right.
So I want to get back to Rosemary in a second, but let me give you one possibility that where the incentives, the woo-woo new fancy technology, and and that venture capital money and others are kind of weirdly coming into play. I was on a discussion the other day on Clubhouse with the CEO of Unite Us, and so Unite Us is a tech plus company that's got a tool which sort of essentially fits into the electronic medical record and allows selection of services for people in front of the doctors or the emergency room nurse or whomever from a whole bunch of social services agencies who don't have any money, but are, grant funded or scrimping by, but they're doing things like housing, food, Meals on Wheels, all the social services stuff, right? Or education, drug rehab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason, they've been incredibly successful. They just raised $150 million and more than $1 billion valuation. And it's really essentially enough of the hospitals think that either they're getting efficiency gains or they're doing it through the good of their hearts, or they think they have enough at-risk contracts. They don't want these people who should be dealt with elsewhere to be medicalized in their system. And they're actually growing all over the country. I mean, they're in a Kaiser, which makes a lot of sense, but they're also in a bunch of these Tony New York hospitals we've talked about. And I'm just wondering if in some, just before I give it to you, Rosemary, there's almost a kind of weird cross subsidy where, the venture capitalists are funding the idea that these guys can take enough margin out of the hospitals with the hospitals, willingness to, maybe the health plans. and move that money to where it needs to go, rather than doing it in a more rational government-based way that perhaps Jeff might think about. Rosemarie?
Well, so there's another wrinkle, and so full disclosure, they've been a client of ours, so I'm pretty familiar with them, and they have a really interesting business proposition, and it isn't just what they're doing in the hospital, and private healthcare sector side. They're also marketing heavily to states and looking for that level of infrastructure investment too. So it's actually kind of it's a combined strategy.
But it is a way, correct me if I'm wrong, is it a way, correct me if I'm wrong, of getting money that is currently spent in medical care in hospitals and refunneling it and and attaching it to patients who are going to these social services agencies? Is that a fair description of what they're doing?
I think that's part of what they're doing, but they're also very much an infrastructure that supports the whole wave of ACOs. And I'm particularly familiar with the Medicaid ACOs, where there's a lot of work to try and address all the social determinants of health, and to better coordinate that with these sort of beleaguered community-based organizations. And so it's a way to knit all of that together. And that's not necessarily a hospital play. It's another dimension, I would say.
But if we go back to the ACO thing, Jeff, go back to our 5 waves of trying to do, risk, but not really doing it properly. That is sort of probably poster child number 1 for Jeff about things we've done which haven't really made any difference, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, the idea that you can better coordinate the care and find alternative pathways for people, I mean, that isn't in the first instance about money. It's about social efficiency and about humanity, about treating people in a humane and thoughtful way. It isn't about the money.
I understand, but United Us is charging the hospitals and charging the health plans, and now starting to charge the states and others, to provide that service.
Well, realize that, under the old system, you basically had a social work department trying to do this stuff. And you had large, wealthy hospitals trying to coordinate care and refer to organizations that hate their guts. Hate them.
Right.
Because they're awash in dollars and arrogant and, think they're the center of the universe. And they're out there, literally, by a wing and a prayer, kind of hanging on from funding cycle to funding cycle. So there's been a huge cultural and political disconnect between that matrix of services for people and this octopus that Vince began our conversation by talking about.
Rosemarie, Michael, then Rosemarie.
Matthew, I want to go back to what Jeff said about underinvestment for a moment. The kind of organizations that you're talking about, I love what they're doing, okay? But it is bright, shiny object to think that those kind of organizations at scale are going to solve the problem without the kind of investment that Jeff is talking about. It's just enables us to indulge in our capitalistic fantasy world that the invisible hand will do it without the invisible hand reaching into its wallet. And one of the things that has haunted me about this sort of don't worry, the for-profit world will take care of it is a talk that Bruce Bosno of Humana made a few years ago about how their Medicaid Advantage plan finds through various algorithms people who are in need of food and gives them food. Well, and I thought to myself, what a great country. Join the right health plan and we won't let you starve.
Well, I'm a Humana Medicare.
I know you are.
Person,
I know.
And believe it or not, after I got cancer, there was this nurse calling me up, well, what's happening? What's going on? She was sort of trying to keep up on what was going on. And then at the end, when they realized they weren't going to be add any value, they sent me an entire huge box full of food. They sent me on my 280-acre farm a big box full of food.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And then
there was some AI targeting that went wrong there, possibly.
So much for the algorithm, Jeff.
I was amazed. I obviously wasn't eating very well.
But I thought of the marketing campaign, which is change plans and starve to death. I mean, we talk about getting people sticky, right? Join our plan and eat, really. And the fact that we don't see this as absurd, is really because we're fixated on it's going to be solved by the invisible hand. Sometimes it isn't, right? The genius of America over the years has been government and private sector together. And we start to get into this, no, it's only government, no, it's only the private sector. And that's just not historically true.
Absolutely. I wrote about it in my book.
Rosemarie,
Throw that in.
but
Yeah.
I like to go back to this a bit more because you obviously wrote a book about changing healthcare and changing the and ways to campaign around this. I'm still a bit lost as to we have all this money in healthcare, we have the infrastructure bill, we now have some money for caregiving. May or may not happen. We don't really agree about whether it can get passed about the filibuster and the reconciliation or whatever. But I mean, do you the point that I talked about, and with Unite Us, and they're not the only ones. There's Now Power and Armed Birth and a few others who are kind of in that business of, can we use a technological solution to sort of redistribute money and services and identify and use data and use all this great stuff that comes out of Silicon Valley types to identify where all these holes are and maybe send them housing and maybe send them food and all the rest of it. Whether or not the algorithm got Jeff wrong and he didn't need the food because he just slaughtered a pig or whatever on his farm, you can kind of say that there are ways of doing this, right? There are a lot of technological solutions for people in need. I mean, there are people, there's companies, doing things with Snap and elsewhere. Is that a rational place for us to go?
But if you're just sort of like moving the deck chairs around within kind of a existing pie, as opposed to perhaps getting the attention of some of these billionaire tech company owners, if they looked at the data from the algorithm and saw all these gaps, perhaps they would be moved to think about taxation differently. I am completely being cynical here, but
that's the April Fool.
There you go. There has to be a fundamental redistribution and reduction of inequality. If you just are working with the same sort of pie, like here's how much we're going to spend on food for poor people, and you maybe can allocate what exists a little more efficiently with these tech solutions, that's not enough.
So
I silenced everyone.
I mean, you're right. Well, you silenced us all because you said that all the tech titans are going to agree to more taxation, and
and now I'll be kicked off your show.
No, I'm all for it. I'm all for the wealth tax. I don't understand that, why. Okay, maybe Jeff Bezos needed the incentives to be as rich as he is, but the Walton kids, that entire family, worth whatever it is, $200 billion between them, who inherited that money, and I don't.
Well, they were smart.
Why they should have it, and kids are, what it is, a quarter of kids were until the recent Rescue Act were going hungry. And we've actually done some things, although temporary, in the Rescue Act, which really rearrange the money we're spending. But we haven't done the other side of it, which is adding to the deficit, which is okay. But as Jeff pointed out, and maybe this is how it gets through reconciliation, I don't know. In the proposal for the for the infrastructure bill, there's a whole bunch of money taxation, which is going to kind of cut the loophole with the last $2 trillion we spent, which was, well, not the last, $2 ago, $2 trillion we spent, which was Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, ramming through the tax cut, which no one understood, but was a big giveaway. And the data showing didn't actually do much to help the economy, which isn't that much of a surprise.
It did accumulate a lot of $1.4 trillion worth of stock buybacks, though.
Well, I mean, it's a lot to help the stock market, but not much to help the economy. The stock market, by the way, is still going up. Where record high was yesterday or today again. So there's still optimism there. So we only have a couple of minutes before we go to our roundup. But I guess the question is how the things we talked about. A significant change in the way we're thinking about social determinants of health, significant investment in caregiving to help when we get back in the labor force, but also to, professionalize that lay caregiving role. And by the way, there are some tech companies I know who are trying to do that as well, including Signify Health, who just went public. How realistic is that to happen over the next 2, 3, 4 years? Do we generally think it's going to happen, or is it a nice proposal we'll kind of get?
I think it's going to happen. I mean, I think there are so many positive political consequences of pulling it off. I mean, I think it's the Democratic Party has been kind of lost in the wilderness here the last decade or so. Obama aside. Obama did very little to build the Democratic coalition. It withered away during his time in office. So there's a lot of building that needs to go on in order for this party to be viable long term. And if it is going to be viable long term, they're going to have to actually deliver benefits to their core constituents and to a lot of people that aren't their core constituents, that are sitting on the fence, and maybe like me and a couple of other people in the room aren't affiliated with either political party. You know, they've got to prove that they can actually improve people's lives, and not just by tinkering with incentives. So maybe they succeed here.
Okay. Yeah, they've got 2 years to do it. I mean, you said 2, 3, 4. Can't count on what's going to happen in the midterms, right? So,
really, they've got about 6 months to do this.
Right.
The clock is ticking, and God love them. Ron Klain and the rest of those folks are smart enough to know, and learned enough for their experience with Obama to know they don't get a second chance.
Right. So absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So the time is of the essence for them. And they're going big and bold. And I love that it's coming from a 78-year-old president. It's incredible.
And they're not talking about how great they are, how smart they are. They're smarter than somebody else. They're just
well, no, and that's where actually the communication style is fascinating, because for a lot of the boldness of it, there's just who Biden is, and the way, you know, as an older white guy, and just his tone of all the things, he can come off as very middle of the road and reassuring, even if he's saying something that is rather bold.
Did you see his press conference? It was really genius. I was stunned. He wasn't an Alzheimer's patient in that press conference. He was funny and interesting, and he seemed to understand exactly what he was doing.
Yeah. That's a radical thought for
unlike the last guy.
A radical thought for a presidential body. Okay, so on that, let's we just have a couple of minutes to wrap it up. So let's go around, and I want to ask each of you what you're expecting to see in the next few weeks. What excitement you're expecting off, and this could be real, could be a joke, we don't know. So Vince, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, okay. So I think what I'm really tuned into is watching the day-to-day COVID numbers. You know, are we going to see that third, whatever you want to call it, fourth wave? It looks like it's creeping up there. I will also just use this as a chance to answer a question that I posed previously of what are the numbers of, if you've been vaccinated, can you still spread the disease? And, you know, I'll share what I've been reading. I've seen now a number of studies that suggest that the answer is it's good, that you are not able, or you are very minimally likely to be able to spread the disease once we're vaccinated. So the public policy issue becomes, you know, let's vaccinate as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. Not that complicated, but there's still a lot of resistance out there.
Rosemarie, what are you looking at next few weeks?
It's really the surge in availability of vaccine, which is incredible. But it's I know you just said, Vince, it's not complicated, but I'm working with some of the organizations that are trying to scale up as fast as possible. And it's if you're an ops person, it's like a delightful challenge, but extremely challenging. So that's what I'm looking at.
Jeff.
A little bit of a different focus, but I'm watching the Derek Chauvin trial with a great anxiety, because if somehow that guy gets off, we're going to have a spasm of urban violence that will make the 1994 riots after Rodney King look like a block party.
Good point.
If that guy gets off, we're in a heap of trouble.
I agree.
And that may be a more significant determinant of a big push by the Republicans in 2022 than anything that happens with redistricting or with the infrastructure bill or anything else. That trial scares the crap out of me. The prospect that murderer could go free.
Agreed. Michael.
In order to get his legislative package through Congress, the Biden administration will hire Jared Kushner as their legislative liaison, impressed with the way that he brought peace to the Middle East and the fact that the Republicans will believe anything he says.
That's fantastic.
Touche.
April.
Happy April Fool's Day.
No. We have to figure out which one of these is the real joke and which one people believe.
But I also think that from a healthcare point of view, we'll be looking at information blocking regulation coming into effect next week. And, COVID continues to dominate everything. The other thing I would say in response to sort of our larger discussion about some of the social issues is really what we have as an America culturally that's divided between the forces of I'm okay, Jack, and but for the grace of God go I, right? And our public goes back and forth depending on how bad the stock market crash is, or the recession, or COVID. And COVID has opened up a window of there, but for the grace of God go I, that Biden is trying to take advantage of. And God willing, he'll be successful.
I'll leave you with a thought that's a bit out of left field, like Jeff's, which is that that's something that Chauvin Child and looking at the possibility of riots and is a big deal, could derail a lot of stuff. The other thing that could derail a lot of stuff is foreign policy. And the last few weeks, the Chinese have put a bunch of Hong Kong democracy people in jail.
Yep.
Probably, the sort of veteran lawyers have been making it very tough and are doing a lot of saber rattling about what they want to do with Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And if that blows up, probably everything we're talking about goes off the table, because that changes the focus of the world. So I'm my fingers are crossed that they sort of wiser heads prevail there, but you never know. We've got to say those things, they're wild cards, but they can really influence everything, including all that domestic stuff we've been talking about. So with that,
one more domestic thing which cannot be forgotten. All of the voter suppression laws that are working their way through the various state houses, and people like Kemp and Georgia are signing, are frightening and deserve a lot of attention, because it's not just about do the Democrats deliver something through the rescue plan and all that for Americans, but what is happening at the state level. That voter infrastructure is vital.
And we may or may not, we're not going to get a Voting Rights Act through without, with the current filibuster. So you can't pretend that's about money. So we'll see how that goes. Mm-hmm. All right. So I want to again thank my guest today on THCB Gang. I had Jeff Goldsmith from the Wild. I'm really having technical issues today. There we go. Jeff Goldsmith from his 288-acre hog farm in Virginia, or whatever you've got crying there. Rosemarie Day, CEO of Day Health Strategies in Massachusetts. Michael Millenson, holding up the Midwest end, or the Midwest Center, Health Quality Advisors in Chicago. And Vince Kuraitis from the wilds and craziness of Idaho. Vince, thanks everyone for your time. Thanks everyone for watching and for listening on the podcast. We are talking about figuring out a way to get this on the Clubhouse in the next couple of weeks. So there may be some changes there. Watch on THCB for announcements about that. But with that, this is Matthew Holt